Hi people, this is a video lecture about compromise in the Constitution. You should be taking notes on this, and this will be checked as one of your right side entries in your interactive notebook. So when we talk about the Constitution, you're all familiar with this. You've talked about it in Econ Civ. But we also have to understand something about why this document was created in the first place. So the Constitutional Convention, which is the meeting that was convened in order to come up with this document, grew out of a series of meetings that the new United States had early in the late 1780s to start talking about some of the problems in the Articles of Confederation, America's first system of government. One recurring problem that they had to solve was the question of interstate commerce. So how is the federal government going to control a state like Virginia selling something like tobacco to Maryland, or a state like New York shipping something like finished woolen textiles down to Georgia, something like that. The other big issue that really came up and showed how weak the Articles of Confederation was Shays' Rebellion, which we talked about in class, where a bunch of farmers in Western Massachusetts rose up against their government, and the government really wasn't able to do anything about it because the U.S. government didn't have a standing army, right? So that taxing problem, how are you going to actually finance things that the federal government is doing? So at the Constitutional Convention, there are 55 individuals, people who we call the framers, who come together in order to kind of fix the Articles of Confederation. There are 55 delegates. They come from every state of the new union, except for Rhode Island. Rhode Island didn't send anybody. And these are mostly, in terms of age, there's a diverse group. The youngest delegate is 27, the oldest is 81, but most of them are in their 30s or 40s, so for the most part, they are adult professionals. They're all men, obviously. And some of them are very rich, some of them are extremely wealthy, but for the most part, even the ones who are not really wealthy are comfortable, right? We're not seeing people who are being represented here from the lowest socioeconomic levels of society. Lots of them are lawyers. Something like, I can't even remember how many of them were lawyers, but a large number of them. And a lot of them were also slaveholders. So even if they were not a lawyer, some of them are Southern planters. They, in some cases, have very specific interests that have to do with slavery, that have to do with their own personal wealth. All of these people, for the most part, are well educated in order to be a lawyer. Even if you're a gentleman farmer, you're probably pretty well educated. And a lot of them are really familiar with the sort of thought of the Enlightenment. People like John Locke, who we've talked about before in class, who are subscribers to the idea of natural rights. And also a man whose name is Montesquieu. He is French. His actual name is much longer. He's actually a baron of Montesquieu, but he's usually just referred to by his title. And he is the person who really brought up the idea of separation of powers in government. The idea that if all the power is kind of concentrated in one area, like in a monarchy, there's room for trouble. But if you split up the powers in different branches, they have ways to check and balance each other. So that's where that idea comes from. The father of the Constitution is this lovely gentleman right here. He is very young when he essentially helps write the Constitution. If you think about it as Thomas Jefferson as being the father of the Declaration, this is James Madison. He is the father of the Constitution. And he studied political thought for an entire year prior to 1787 when this meeting was held in order to prepare. He came to the Constitutional Convention ready to throw out the Articles of Confederation, as many of them were at that point, and try to start fresh with something new. Madison also, he has kind of some personal ideologies that are reflected in the plan that he comes up with. He believes that people are naturally selfish and are driven by their emotions and their personal interests, which sounds a lot like our other Enlightenment thinker Thomas Hobbes, if you remember him. He also believes that government can encourage the best in people. So if people's nature is to be kind of less than ideal, kind of greedy, kind of selfish, if you create the right system of government, you can elevate mankind in some way. So Madison's taking this very seriously. And he comes up with what he calls the Virginia Plan. That's this plan over here. His plan for the US government is that it's going to be bicameral, which means two houses, right? Camera actually is a Latin word for room, not for that thing. So we're going to have two houses, and they'll be based on population. So if you have a lot more people in your colony or in your state, as Virginia does, you get to send more delegates. If you're a small state like Rhode Island, you don't really get to send anybody at all, or you only get to send one person. He believes that the federal government should be able to tax, so we're not going to leave that in the hands of the states anymore under Madison's plan, and that the federal government can regulate interstate commerce. So they're going to be the ones who are making sure that there are no tariffs in between states, there are no taxes internal to the country. He also believes that the federal government needs to have more power than the states. So this is somewhat more of a federalist view of the national government, and that the federal government should be able to veto the states' laws. And he believes that in addition to just having a legislature like we do under the Articles of Confederation, we really need an executive and a judicial branch. But his is not the only plan. There's also the New Jersey plan. This one over here. It's proposed by a man whose name was William Paterson from New Jersey. It's not as well remembered because very little of it ends up in the actual Constitution. But Paterson's plan said that we're going to have a unicameral house, or unicameral legislature, one house, and that all the states are going to be represented equally. So sorry, Virginia, you may have more people, but you're only going to be able to send the same number of delegates as some of the other smaller colonies like Rhode Island. He also says that the federal government should be able to tax and regulate interstate commerce. You can kind of tell how big of an issue this was because both of these plans are addressing it in the same way. He also says that each state only gets one vote in Congress, similar to the Articles of Confederation, when instead of individuals being able to cast votes, the state has to vote as a whole. And he also says that we need to establish more branches of government, right? It can't just all be in the legislature. Just to give you a visual sense of how these look, and you can pause if you want to look at this in more detail, this is what the Virginia plan would propose. So as you can see here, the 13 states vote directly for the legislature and then vote for state legislatures that then propose the president. So the presidency is not being directly elected under this plan or under our current system of government. And there's going to be a Supreme Court established as well. But the relationships between these are a little bit different. The New Jersey plan, whoa, it's even crazier looking, has a little bit more power in the hands of the individual states. They have more kind of direct influence up here, and these three branches are really kept separate. You can see how the Congress here is only one house, right, instead of the two-house system. So essentially, among these two plans, you get a little bit from the Virginia plan and a little bit from the New Jersey plan that ends up in both. So what we end up going with is this idea of a bicameral legislature. We're going to have two houses, but this question about representation is a sticking point. The big colonies, or states at this point that have a lot of population, really want their representation to be based on population, right? Which gives them political power. The small states really want this to be based on equal representation. The idea that each state gets one vote, that seems to make sense to some of them, but there's some other kind of sticking points in here as well. So there are two major compromises that are made. The first one is called, in a very creative bout of naming, the Great Compromise. And the Great Compromise is really addressing this question. Should states with more people have more representatives in Congress and, by extension, more power in the federal government? So to solve this question, a plan is proposed by Roger Sherman and Oliver Ellsworth, who are two of the delegates to the convention. They say, okay, we're going to have two houses, but they're not going to be elected the same way. We will have one house, the upper house, the Senate, which will be equal representation. Everybody gets to send two representatives. No matter how big you are, no matter how long you've been in the Union, two representatives. The lower house, the House of Representatives, has proportional representation. So that is based on population. So today, a state like California sends a whole bunch more electors than does Montana, even though Montana is still also a pretty big state in terms of geography, because nobody lives in Montana. So when we talk about Congress today in the federal government, we're talking about the two houses together, the bicameral system, the Senate plus the House of Representatives. There is no such thing as an Illinois Congress or an Alaska Congress. That doesn't exist. The only Congress that we talk about in this country is the federal Congress. So the other question here, after they figure out the two houses, is, well, who do you count in order for your population to be determined? That may seem really obvious, but there's a lot of questions, particularly in the South. Should slaves be included in the population? slaves have no political rights during this time, but and Virginia is not necessarily proposing that they be given political rights, but they would like to count them so that they can increase their population numbers and then increase their power in Congress, or at least in the House of Representatives. So, oh, I left off information about this. Essentially, what happens is that I can't believe I did that. Let me pause and see if I can add this slide back. Hang on. Okay, we're back. Sorry, I realized I probably should write it down since it's important. So here's how the 3/5 compromise gets worked out. Each slave is going to be counted as 3/5 of a person. That's why it's called, again, creatively, the 3/5 compromise for population purposes only. So the Constitution in no place directly talks about slaves as individuals. It actually talks about the persons who reside within a state and all other persons. So the founders are really skirting this question of slavery. The only really direct mention of slavery in the entire Constitution is a provision that is going to end the Atlantic slave trade 20 years after the Constitution is adopted, so in the early 1800s. But the founders totally work around this question of whether slavery should even exist. They leave it for future generations to try to figure out, even though it's clear that this is an issue. Otherwise, we wouldn't see these references to it in the Constitution at all. So essentially, while this compromise kind of helps figure out what representation looks like, it does not do anything for slaves or Native Americans in terms of granting those groups political powers. In order to be a voter, a true citizen in this country at the time that the Constitution is written, you are probably male, white, land owning, and probably Protestant at this time as well. Because remember, the Constitution predates the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights are meant to amend the Constitution. So essentially, when we look at these two plans, the Virginia plan really wins out, but not all of the provisions of it end up in the Constitution itself. We have the bicameral legislature based both on population and equal representation. We have a lot more power being given to the federal government in terms of taxes and commerce. But the idea that the federal government can veto state laws is sort of left up in the air. And of course, we do have different branches of government that are established with the Constitution as well. So if you remember those earlier diagrams of how the other proposed legislatures or government systems looked, here's sort of what our current system looks like. So again, you have all people being counted, not just in the 13 states, but in the entire country, are able to send to vote for people in the Electoral College, who then elect the president. But we do have direct election of people both in the House of Representatives and the Senate. And that didn't even happen in the original Constitution. In order to keep the higher house of the Senate and the lower house of the House of Representatives a little bit more separate, originally state legislatures would elect their senators. So under the original Constitution in 1787, the only voice that the people had as individual voters was to send representatives to the House, not to the Senate or even to the presidency for that matter. So we will talk more about all of these nuances of the Constitution in the days to come, as well as how many people hated this system and did not want to get on board with it at all. A lot more people than maybe you think. See you soon.